I'm Steve Dicus, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this final lecture in this summer's Hot Topics lecture series. This is also a CLE event, so if you're a lawyer looking for CLE credit, you can sign up where? Back in the back before you leave. This is also a brown bag event, so don't be shy about finishing your lunch during the lecture. There'll be a short question and answer session at the end of Peter's remarks, and I'll send the microphone around to take your questions. We're happy to welcome Peter Schwartzstein, one of Vermont Law School's very distinguished media fellows for 2017. Peter is a British-American environmental journalist based in Cairo who currently works primarily in the Middle East. He writes about regional geopolitical issues with a focus on transboundary water disputes, agriculture, environmental security, climate, energy, and refugees. You can get a sense of Peter's extremely broad range of interest and maybe about his sense of humor if I give you the titles of a couple of his most recent articles. Crocodile poaching booms as Egypt tourist crumbles. That appeared in the National Geographic last month. Another is entitled, How NASA's Satellites Can Help Solve the Middle East Water Crisis in Newsweek. And in the Smithsonian Magazine, How an Alcohol-Hating English Preacher Founded Global Tourism. This is about Thomas Cook of Cook's Tours. Peter's work has also appeared in Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, Daily Beast, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and other periodicals. Before moving to Cairo, he worked for a time for Reuters in London. In 2016, Peter won first place in the Society for Environmental Journalists Awards for reporting on the environment in the beat large market. Peter's presentation today is entitled, The Killing of the Middle East's Environment. Please welcome Peter Schwartzstein.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Can everyone hear me? More or less. I've picked a few topics that I feel are both extraordinarily important, but also sort of pretty underreported. We, the media, both Western and local in the Middle East, have a tendency to sort of focus on bombs and bullets and coups, sort of things that are, on the surface at least, sort of extraordinarily gripping, and on the surface at least, significantly more important than kind of many of the sort of broad water and food woes that I'm going to discuss. But the problem is that it's not just us, the media, that are kind of perhaps looking at the breaking news. Among regional policymakers and decision makers and civil society, the environment is just considered a pretty distant priority. A story that I love to tell, because I think it's both tragic and amusing in equal measure, is that in Egypt, the Ministry of Environment is more or less considered a punishment posting. One supposedly true tale is that an Egyptian diplomat who had drunkenly embarrassed himself at a European embassy was consigned to sort of an ignominious end in a sort of desk in the Ministry of Environment. In Iraq, the Ministry of Environment no longer exists. In 2015, it was rolled into the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Water Resources, which was tasked with taking up many of its responsibilities, has had its budget cut from $1.7 billion in 2013 to $90 million last year. So not only is the environment considered a very, very distant concern, but there isn't the money really to tackle anything, even if there were to be the desire. So perhaps the too long didn't read is that everything is terrible and no one cares. But I'm going to talk just a little bit about transboundary water disputes, talk a little bit about some of the water shortages that underpin many of these disputes, talk perhaps even more briefly about how some of these water issues are worsening food security woes in the region, and finish up with something which I find particularly interesting, something that I've been working on a lot over the last few years, is sort of the security implications of the Middle East and Africa's crumbling environment. So these are just a sort of a few background images to distract as I drone on. This is the source of the Blue Nile, some monks bathing in hippo-infested waters. But moving to Cairo a little over 4 years ago, it didn't take me very long at all to realize the kind of enormous pull, the enormous weight that the Nile carries in the country, and with very good reason. About 98% of Egypt's water comes from the Nile. These are the headwaters of the Nile, kind of a few miles out of its source. About 95% of Egypt's population lives within 15 miles of the river's banks. And in the past, it was sort of even more of a kind of absolute necessity. I mean, everything from taxes to urban design was determined by the Nile. You notice if you were to visit Egypt, that kind of the pharaonic temples or anything old is set back several miles from the river, and that's because every August the river used to burst its banks, and consequently it simply wasn't possible to build right by the water. But it didn't take me much longer at all to realize that not all was well with the river. In large part because Ethiopia, which the Egyptians have regarded as a sort of adversary for several thousand years, the upstream state, is in the midst of an enormous dam building program. And in Cairo, this has led to tremendous saber rattling. During the tenure of Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president, who ruled from 2012 to 2013, there were even threats of war. And then even in subsequent administrations, Egypt has been in some ways backing up its rhetoric. Egypt purchased a few battleships, a few Mistral battleships last year, which are thought of as a kind of key component of a long-range sort of amphibious strike, which is to say that kind of transboundary water disputes are, at this point, more than talk. A lot of countries are ensuring they have the tools to sort of back up their fighting words. But given how important the Nile was, given how prominent it was, sort of looking out from my apartment, I decided not long ago to travel the length of the river from its source in the western highlands of Ethiopia, the Blue Nile source, right on down to the Mediterranean. And the subtext to it all really is that while dams are perhaps a key flashpoint, one of the more one of the more tangible illustrations of water disputes, there's much more to it than that. Across the Nile Basin, countries like Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan are absolutely booming. Egypt's population has tripled in the last 37 years, going from a little over 30 million to 93 million now. Ethiopia has doubled in population in the last 18 years. It's over 100 million now. And so at the same time as demand is substantially increasing, you also have threats to supply. In Ethiopia, agriculture is traditionally rain-fed. Like, such was the amount of rainfall that despite the fact that they had a very large number of bountiful waterways passing by their fields, they didn't feel they had to touch it. But now, with rainfall growing more and more erratic in the Ethiopian highlands, which account for about 80% of the Nile's flow, farmers there are increasingly looking to tap these rivers. And so at the same time as you have more mouths to feed, you have kind of more farmers and more people who are intent on, you have kind of a potentially sort of smaller pie from which everyone can pick. And while the Nile is perhaps one of the best known and sort of dramatic illustrations of this phenomenon, this is the place called the Mogollon in the center of Khartoum, the Sudanese capital. It's the point at which the Blue and White Niles meet. So to your right, you have the Blue Nile, which is slightly shorter but carries much of the volume. And then on your left, you have the White Nile, which kind of emanates from the Great Lakes region in Central Africa. And some very poetic locals have called it the longest kiss in history, because the Ethiopian Blue Nile is it's very brown. It's kind of chock full of sediment, while the White Nile is a slightly sickly yellow. And for a while, at least, they kind of run alongside one another before finally merging a few miles hence. But while the Nile is perhaps one of the best-known illustrations of this kind of increased tussle for water among many countries, it's far from the only one. Another water basin in which I frequently work is the Tigris and Euphrates River Basin. There, both rivers rise in. I don't think I've got any pictures of that. Both rivers rise in Turkey, and the Turks, as they struggle with diminished rainfall in various parts of the country, have been holding more and more water back. Turkey has built something like 532 mega dams and about 3,500 dams of all sizes since the 1950s. And unsurprisingly, this is having a very pronounced effect on the downstream countries. And even among allies, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, they are very close. And yet they are in the midst of a kind of pretty deep diplomatic struggle over ownership of an aquifer that spans their border. So the conventional wisdom increasingly in the Middle East is that with populations booming everywhere and with climate change threatening to cut precipitation and with kind of higher temperatures already evaporating more water, the fear is that it might be water, not oil, over which people one day fight in the area. This is the kind of ferry crossing Lake Nasser, which spans the Egyptian-Sudanese border on the Nile. It was formed by the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s. And while, I mean, the Aswan High Dam is in many ways a kind of perfect example of both the benefits and pitfalls of a dam. It produced so much electricity for so long that it was instrumental in Egypt's development over the latter half of the 20th century. But building a dam in one of the hottest places on Earth was, in retrospect, not the brightest of moves. Something like 10 billion cubic meters of water evaporate from this enormous lake every year. And to put that in perspective, Egypt's entire share of the Nile River is about 55 billion cubic meters. So up to 20% of their share just sort of evaporates into thin air every year. I mean, while kind of many of these transboundary water disputes are motivated in large part by fears, Egypt, for example, fears that with its population growing, it won't one day have the water at its disposal to equip them with what they need. In many parts of the world, including this one, water scarcity is already a fact of life. In Egypt, despite the presence of this huge, bountiful river, there are already water shortages, which have been referred to slightly overly grandiosely as a revolution of the thirsty. In the Nile Delta, kind of towards the upper reaches of the Nile, during the dry season, during Ethiopia's dry season, many of the sort of more distant farming communities receive no water, which, unsurprisingly, they haven't taken sitting down. There have already been considerable acts of civil disobedience with farmers and their families blocking roads. And were that phenomenon to continue, I think it entirely possible that you'd be having perhaps open clashes between state security services and farmers irate at the lack of water. In Jordan, I've been commissioned to write an article in September about what happens when a country runs out of water. And I'm going to write it almost entirely about Jordan, a country which is deeply water impoverished. Its only surface water is the Jordan River, which I don't know if any of you have seen the Jordan River, but it scarcely, even in good times, deserved the title river. I mean, were it not for its biblical significance, no one would have heard of it. It kind of now extends from about this wall to maybe about halfway to the opposite wall. In Lebanon, I think have some pictures of Lebanon further up. In Lebanon, such has been the impact of the arrival of 2 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon's natural population is about 4.5 million, so one can imagine it doesn't take much to see the pressure that is exerted on the country's food and water resources. But on the coastal strip, so extending from Beirut up to the north, the coastal aquifers are so tapped out in many places that the water coming up is too saline to shower in. And in fact, in some places, the water from the ground is too salty even to do washing up, because after an hour or two's exposure to this water, cutlery just rusts. But then perhaps one of the more dramatic illustrations of kind of looming water scarcity, or existing water scarcity in the Middle East, are the marshes of southern Iraq, which some of you might have read about or heard about, particularly back in the 1990s. But they achieved a certain tragedy back in the early 90s when Saddam Hussein ordered them to be drained. And he ordered that because there'd been a rebellion in the south, and the sort of defeated remnants of the rebellion fled into these sort of narrow series of marshes and waterways through which sort of dissidents and bandits had, for hundreds of years, sought sanctuary. And in the aftermath of the US invasion in 2003, one of the relatively few sort of totally good news stories was the revival of the marshes. American engineers broke the dikes that Saddam's engineers had built to prevent the Euphrates and Tigris rivers from spreading out into this enormous floodplain. But that good news story, unfortunately, is no longer one of. The marshes are dying again. From a peak of about 75% recovered, they are now down to about 40% of their original size, and that is happening because of these aforementioned dams in Turkey, and also because Iran has built dams or entirely cut off 21 out of the 42 waterways which pass from its territory into Iraq. And, well, just to throw a bit of climate change in for good measure, northern Iraq in the Kurdish mountains is one of the few parts of the country that sees any degree of precipitation. And just to sort of add to the explosive mix, rainfall has decreased there dramatically. So here in the marshes, many of the sort of traditional professions, buffalo breeding, fishing, rice farming, are scarcely viable, because not only is there sort of minimal water, but what water there is of extraordinarily poor quality. One of the kind of the necessities of large flows of water is that it's sufficient to dilute many of the pollutants that often end up in there through agricultural runoff or through industry. Perhaps I think the statistic that most tellingly kind of indicates what's going on is that kind of prior to kind of wide-scale Turkish dam construction on the Euphrates and Tigris, prior to diminished rainfall in the Kurdish mountains in northern Iraq and in parts of Turkey and Iran, the Shatt al-Arab, which is the combined flow of the Euphrates and Tigris, used to project fresh water about 4 or 5 miles out into the Persian Gulf. But the flow at this point is so diminished that actually the salt water of the Persian Gulf pushes its way now about 70 miles upriver. So in these marshes, which have throughout history been a freshwater expanse, you're now having kind of Indian Ocean species. One story, which I was told, that I'm not yet convinced it's true, is that one of these families living on these little artificial islets woke up to find a shark gnawing at one of their buffalo's heels. But certainly you're getting all sorts of invasive species that can survive only because of the salinity of the water. This is the boatman who I often hire. It's called Abu Haider, and he sings lovely odes, but not to his wife, to his water buffalo. He's composed these hour-long love songs to his beloved beasts. And actually, these are large dikes that Saddam and his army built right through the marshes in order to facilitate the troops' passage. Now they actually, a very thin silver lining to their construction is that they make for fine embankments in which the fishermen can pull up and offload their catch to distributors. One thing I heard only yesterday, which I think is fascinating, is that the marshes have actually had something of a brief reprieve this summer. Water flow has increased over the course of several months. Fishing has been at its best for several years. But apparently the reason for that is that the Iraqi army ordered the engineers at the Mosul Dam, just to the north of Mosul, to release additional amounts of water over the duration of the Mosul campaign in order to prevent ISIS fighters from easily crossing back and forth. They wanted it to be as fast-flowing as possible in order to prevent weaponry from being shifted easily, and also to ensure that some of the low-lying parts of the riverbed couldn't be easily forded. So in order to, for kind of military efficacy, the country has, sacrificed considerable amounts of water this year. This is a reporting trip in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley in which I realized later that day that I'd taken only a fraction of the number of necessary quotes because I'd spent far too much time playing with the puppies in the field. So I had a computer meltdown a few months ago and lost 5 years' worth of photographs. This is an odd selection of photographs which I've extracted from my email. But unsurprisingly, these tremendous water problems have had very serious implications for food security in the Middle East and North Africa. In the case of Saudi Arabia, for the past 30 to 40 years, Saudi Arabia has been increasingly trying to attain a measure of food self-sufficiency. But as of about 3 or 4 years ago, they've had to sort of wave the white flag and admit that's not going to happen. And that's because they have almost entirely tapped out the entire Arabian Peninsula aquifer in pursuit of their own sort of domestic wheat supply. Now, if you're Saudi Arabia, you are swimming in oil revenues. They're perhaps not swimming in them to the extent they were a few years ago. And as a consequence, they've had the resources to buy in as much food as they need on the international market for as long as global food prices are comparatively low. People like them will be okay. Saudi and another number of other Gulf states have also been purchasing large tracts of land in East and Central and West Africa. It's a very complicated phenomenon which is all sorts of very serious potential hiccups to it. Many people are referring to it as a sort of latter-day colonialism. But anyway, when it comes to food security, the likes of Saudi Arabia and UAE are not those that we're really worrying about. The country that I do worry about considerably when it comes to food is that in which I live, Egypt. Egypt is already the world's largest wheat importer. And with a booming population and with a river flow and groundwater resources that are kind of perilously near the edge, few people have any kind of serious idea how the country is going to manage in the future. Every year, Egypt loses about 15,000 acres to urban encroachment on agricultural land. And when you only have about 8.5 million acres of agricultural land to begin with, that's pretty devastating. This is a once sort of rural idyll called Dahab Island, which is in the middle of the Nile, just to the south of Cairo city center. It was almost entirely covered with greenery until about 3 or 4 years ago, but its population has boomed from about 10,000 to about 72,000 in 4 years alone. And so at the same time as that kind of the sort of need for food is increasing with kind of swelling populations, there simply isn't the water to kind of boost domestic food production. And Egypt and Sudan is probably even more impoverished than, well, certainly is significantly more impoverished than Egypt, particularly after South Sudan seceded in 2011, taking with it many of the oil revenues. Sudan has to spend about $1.5 billion a month on wheat imports, money that it can sort of ill afford to spend. And again, climate change is very much a factor. In southern Egypt and northern Sudan, kind of key growing areas, crop yields are shrinking as sort of unprecedentedly high temperatures take their toll. This is a little town called Dongola in northern Sudan. They can't grow cash crops like fruits anymore because they're just getting scorched by the sun. And these are Syrians working in a fruit workshop in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. I mean, they're treated as little more than slaves by their employers, and paid perhaps 20 to 30 cents a day, which the employers can get away with given the sheer volume of labor, kind of desperate laborers on their doorstep. And in Lebanon's case, they have kind of relatively little land to begin with, and it's shrinking fast as everything from kind of luxury tourist developments to refugee camps are kind of built on these all-important crop-growing fields. So 20 years ago, Lebanon grew about 55% of its own food. Last year, they imported 80% of their food. And then, yeah, this is central Sudan. You also have desertification. About 5 or 6 years ago, this was I'm not sure if thriving is the word, but it was a food-producing field several miles from Lake Nasser, and now it's fit for nothing but perhaps the grazing of a few animals here or there. Yeah, it's fairly depressing stuff. And kind of working on food and water security for a while sort of led me to wonder about the security implications of a fast crumbling environment. I perhaps first took an interest in this while working in Sudan a few years ago. 8 out of Sudan's 18 states are in some kind of conflict, and the single biggest contributor is a loss of grazing land. Many of the pastoral tribes have been pitched into conflict as the kind of amount of available grazing land has shrunk. You've got more people squabbling over a shrinking resource. And in Iraq's case, I think I've got a map here to illustrate it. I've also, for the past year and a half to 2 years, been taking a real interest in the sort of number of the root causes of ISIS's emergence in Iraq and parts of Syria. And it's a very complicated, nuanced debate. There is no single easy answer as to why this sort of horrible, brutal force emerged in the first place. But it seems fairly clear to me at this point, and to many others, that there was an environmental factor in it all. And I'll try and sort of explain my take through various sort of isolated examples. I started doing quite a lot of field work near Tikrit, where the red dot is, which is Saddam Hussein's hometown. It's at the southern periphery of where rain-fed agriculture has historically been possible in Iraq. Everything to the south of there has, since the Sumerian era, been irrigated with river water. But over the course of the last 4 to 5 years, rainfall in the winter necessary for the wheat harvest has diminished to such a point that agriculture in this almost entirely agrarian area had crumbled to, it just wasn't viable. And I found that in a number of these villages, sort of just to the west of Tikrit, an average of 200 to 250 villagers had joined ISIS when its recruiters came along from early 2014 onwards. And I wondered how that compared to villages of a similar sectarian makeup. It's an almost entirely Sunni Arab area there. And so I went to a number of villages about 25 to 30 miles south, just to the west of Samara. And here, rain-fed agriculture has never been viable. And as a consequence, local villages had access to supplementary irrigation. They had an irrigation canal that branched off from the Tigris River. And then these villages, again, with a similar sectarian makeup, and which prior to the drought had very similar levels of prosperity to the villages a little further to the north, I found that an average of 15 to 20 villages, so whatever that is, sort of significantly fewer, had flocked to ISIS's ranks. And interestingly, that's not kind of the environment as an additional incentive for terror recruitment is not a uniquely ISIS phenomenon, of course. Even among the anti-ISIS forces, you have very similar things. So down here in the marshes, which I was talking about a little bit earlier, the marshes are where about 60% of the Shiite militias' manpower come from. And the Shiite militias have been kind of very much the bedrock of the anti-ISIS coalition over the course of the last few years. And in the middle of the marshes, some of the images I showed earlier were kind of around here, middle of the central marsh. In the middle of the marshes, many of the sort of traditional professions, rice farming, buffalo breeding, are still viable. And as a consequence, the Shiite militias and the federal forces haven't enjoyed much success in recruiting there, because people are not desperately in need of income. People have, they have all sorts of problems, but it's not sort of desperation stations. And yet, if one goes a little further out, if one goes to villages around here, this is an area called the Upper Zarga Marsh, which even since the breaking of the dikes and the reflooding post-2003 has never sort of really returned to anything like its prior state. There's kind of very little water. And as a consequence, none of the sort of traditional professions, the buffalo farming, the buffalo breeding, the fishing, the rice farming, are viable. And so the villages in the Upper Zarga Marsh have yielded something like 60 to 70 fighters for the Shiite militias each. And just one more kind of means of illustrating that in Iraq. It's Baghdad there. Around Kirkuk. Kirkuk is the site of some of the world's earliest oil fields. In fact, up until the 1950s or 60s, its oil fields were among the very richest in the world. And I visited a few villages just to the immediate south of Kirkuk. And these villages have been eviscerated by oil runoff and just sort of made generally sort of near uninhabitable by various pollutants sort of flowing in off the oil fields. And as a consequence, in these villages, an average of 300 to 350 young men had joined either the army or the federal police. While if one went a little further out to villages with a very similar sectarian makeup, they're mostly Sunni Turkmen, where agriculture was still viable, where kind of they were far enough out not to have suffered from quite the same degree of pollution, farming was still very much a thing. Just a totally irrelevant bit of trivia. These foothills here, kind of quite rugged, not very high foothills called the Hamrin Mountains. That's where much of the ISIS leadership is believed to be hanging out, having fled from Mosul, which is here, and then found a lot of the road cut off further north. One of the few directions they could run was down here into the, here, not here, into the Hamrin Mountains. So that's a totally irrelevant bit of trivia. But just a sort of an appendix to all of that. One of the, to my mind, sort of particularly devastating devastating things is that while ISIS's emergence can be seemingly explained in part through environmental phenomena, ISIS has gutted the environment to such an extent that I can't really see how we can kind of prevent the perhaps emergence of the next iteration of ISIS at some point down the line. This is a farmer who lived at the foothills of Mount Sinjar, which was, as some of you might remember, the location, the site of the massacre of the Yazidis in the summer of 2014. And he returned home to find that ISIS had uprooted every single one of his water pipelines. In many instances, they'd chop them up in order to make makeshift mortars and pipe bombs. And the rationale seems to be that as ISIS were beaten back, they've adopted scorched earth tactics. From a peak of about 40% of Iraq, they now occupy about 1 or 2%. And their belief seems to be that if we can't govern Iraq, no one can. So they also laced this poor farmer's well with diesel. They stole his generator. They just cannibalized anything for parts that they could get their hands on. The food infrastructure in the region, across northern Iraq and most of Syria, is in absolute tatters. This is a grain silo, and because most of them were built in a very similar style, they've kind of huge, multi-billion grain silos with a large grain elevator in the middle. And because of its elevation, most of them were used either as lookout points or sniper posts, or in some instances, ISIS even seemed to have dragged artillery up there. So this is the grain silo in Sinjar town, which was hit by an airstrike in order to take out the ISIS lookouts at the top. And among some of the few farmers in northern Iraq who have been able to return to their land, who have found that their farms are kind of still fit for agriculture, most of them won't come to this particular one because it was used as a prison for Yazidi women who ISIS were intent on selling into slavery. And this is a large chicken hutch. And as ISIS were beaten back, they were being picked off from the air with great effectiveness. And so you actually, it's a real struggle to find a farm building anywhere in kind of formerly ISIS-occupied territory that is intact, because they would store their vehicles. It's a kind of profound stench of diesel inside the barns, inside chicken hatcheries. So actually throughout northern Iraq and Syria, you've got a huge shortage of chickens right now because the chicken farms were kind of seen as particularly useful as cover. And even though food production in Iraq has decreased dramatically over the course of the last few years because of ISIS's occupation of swathes of the most valuable wheat-growing territory, so much of the transportation infrastructure is so damaged that it's very difficult to import food to kind of take its stead. This is the rail line that went from Aleppo to Mosul, and it's, as you can see it from January of this year, it was blocked with a blown-up car bomb. And so as a consequence, food prices across Iraq have soared. Farmhouses are in tatters. Many oil wells were uncapped as ISIS retreated. And in many instances, particularly at Gayara, to the south of Mosul, it took engineers weeks or months to get them back under control. And just one, I'm wrapping up in a minute. But one of the more devastating kind of bits of environmental damage that ISIS did as it was defeated in Fallujah, a place that many of you undoubtedly heard of, is they blew up the barrage. And that was particularly important because the barrage at Fallujah was responsible for all of the maintaining the level of the irrigation canals that flowed eastwards out of the Euphrates. So this entire swathe of agriculture just to the west of Baghdad was irrigated with Euphrates water that was controlled through Fallujah. But given that that dam, that barrage was blown up, it's been 2 and a bit years since this large plot of land has been farmable. Abu Ghraib, another place that many of you have undoubtedly heard of. Farmers around there are suffering horribly because agriculture is in no way viable. And then just to wrap up, the problem is that it's very hard to see how this cycle can be, how one can stop this cycle from being repeated. Because while in better years, back in the day when Iraq was thriving off a large oil price, a high oil price, they perhaps could have afforded the many billion-dollar recovery bill. But now with kind of revenues way down, no one seems to have the resources to shell out to fix kind of water infrastructure and food infrastructure and to pay farmers the money they need to make their agriculture sort of operable. So yeah, there is no good news. But I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We do have a few minutes for questions. If you'll raise your hand, we'll try to bring a mic to you.
Thank you. I was just wondering, so I know it's a bit of an unrealistic expectation, but in terms of just thinking after World War II, Europe was totally devastated. I mean, is there, assuming or theoretically possible, would some kind of Marshall Plan for Iraq be able to help it recover, or is it just so beyond, like, is the environmental damage so beyond that even pouring a lot of money into it wouldn't do anything?
I mean, in Iraq's case, the situation is potentially salvageable were there to be sufficient kind of international funds available, because we do have a central government in Baghdad that most of us are willing to work with. So there is sort of, I mean, there's considerable corruption, and there are a broad variety of additional concerns, not least kind of large swathes of Iraq are still too complicated to work in. I mean, it's not really yet time to kind of begin the recovery period in parts of the country. But yeah, the short answer is yes. The problem is it's just very hard to see at this time where the resources would come from. Kind of, I mean, Syria is a lot more complicated because there's no sort of accepted international consensus on to whom we'd be directing resources. So Iraq is the comparative good news story. Like, at least we have a vague strategy, while we don't in Syria.
I have a question. You referred again and again to the explosive growth of population in all of these countries as lying at the root of all the environmental problems you described. Does any of these countries have any serious program to try to limit population growth? And can you say how U.S. policy might affect any of those plans?
Yeah, I mean, in many of these countries, it's not so much necessarily that the population is too much for the resources at hand. It's that given the degree of how to articulate this. I think many of these countries could work with their populations were kind of mismanagement not to be quite so prolific. But given that, unfortunately, kind of inefficiencies seem to be built into so many of the systems, it's hard to see how that can happen. But in answer to your question, the U.S. particularly USAID, has historically been very proactive in helping with family planning in many parts of the region. The problem is that so many of our efforts are now being thrown back in our face. In 19 1995, US aid accounted for about 10% of contraception, of all contraceptive devices issued in Egypt, USAID and various other international NGOs, which was thought to be a key plank in Egypt's success in reducing its population growth rate through much of the late 90s and early 2000s. But over the course of the last few years, Egypt has introduced a series of anti-NGO laws, which are designed to, by their reading, kind of prevent any foreign interference. And so it's almost impossible for anyone like USAID to operate. It's impossible for kind of a lot of these European development organizations and private companies to actually contribute. So I don't know. The US has enjoyed some success in the past, but it's not working anymore. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the prospects of mainstream journalism as a tool for effective public good?
I mean, to look at it through an environmental prism, I think journalism has the potential to be highly effective. I mean, in my own, say, very, very small way, I try and kind of lobby some officials whenever I meet them to take more of an interest in their environmental woes. And to my mind, like one of the perhaps the very thin silver lining to the security implications of environmental collapse is that you do have kind of more powerful people increasingly taking an interest in the environment. When I've met with people in the security services in some of these countries, it's only really when you kind of whip out the sort of terrorism link that they'll kind of take their head out of their book and actually listen. So I think slowly, combination of media and some civil society organizations are getting through, but it's a question of whether it's too little, too late.
Oh, sorry, Barbara. Have you seen any collaborations like with countries working together that are facing these water scarcity issues, or is it kind of becoming a race to the bottom and everyone take what they can get?
Actually, yes. I mean, one of the best sort of illustrations of transboundary cooperation in the region has actually been how the Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians together have enjoyed considerable success in reviving the Jordan River. I mean, there's much more to be done, and I think it's a relationship that I'm not sure can be repeated elsewhere for a variety of reasons. But yeah, I think it is too soon to speak of water as a definitive source of potential conflict, because we have had instances when it's even brought countries together. It's had the opposite effect. Yeah.
Peter, thank you for that immensely sobering talk, by the way. It makes us all feel embarrassed about the amount of food we have in our cafeteria. Two questions not related. The first is, we're a law and policy school. We believe deeply in the positive role that law and policy can bring. And internationally, people talk about the development of the rule of law. I wonder if you could speak briefly to the rule of law, which I assume is in similarly dire straits in these countries, and the way it may play a useful role or may not. And then the second is the one we were talking about at dinner on whatever night it was, Tuesday night, which was bringing journalists here who are not necessarily environmental journalists and how they might benefit from the school. I think the audience would be interested in your thoughts about that.
So to the first question, yeah, in so much of the Middle East and North Africa, the kind of environmental regulations themselves are solid. It's not kind of a lack of legislation which has allowed much of the environment to crumble in this manner. It's a total lack of enforcement. For example, in Egypt, there are an estimated 450 to 550 factories kind of right along the river, extending from Aswan north to Cairo, most of which dump their waste directly into the river. And environmental authorities and NGOs have tried to persuade them to change, but kind of in a country where bribes are quite prevalent, these industries have been able to sidestep the rules. So yeah, I think kind of massive improvement in the enforcement of environmental regulations is necessary and probably the most important first step in addressing environmental degradation. To the second, yeah, I hope VLS will continue to take in journalists who have already expressed an interest in the environment. But yeah, I mean, were you to try and sort of maximize the, were you to get journalists from kind of mass market publications in countries like Egypt and India and Iraq, where the environment is seldom written about and perhaps not much understood, it'd be a real means of maximizing the impact of the school's expertise. So perhaps a mixture of environmental journalists and
The major idea would be bring mass market journalists who report generally to
Sure.
VLS and teach them more about environmental issues so they'll go back to their countries and realize the role that environmental issues play.
Exactly. I mean, something like climate change isn't, the nitty-gritty details aren't well understood. I mean, most people in Egypt, even in kind of very poor, out-of-the-way villages with limited access to good education, are entirely aware that something funky is happening with the seasons. But neither they nor many of their kind of better educated counterparts in Egyptian newspapers can necessarily fully articulate what's happening. So were the school to be able to redress that balance, I think that would be enormously useful and yeah.
Peter Schwartzstein, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for coming out.